Shalom everyone, this is Jediah with another video, and I'm very excited to do this video today, and at the same time it's something very personal to me and my family to see where we come from, and not just to see it, but to see it in great detail. I was blessed to find a genetic ancestry analysis company by the name of DNA Tribes that has taken data samples from all over the world, from native populations, not just present day immigrant populations. And they manage a database where they can take your DNA sample and compare it to every sample in their database to not only pinpoint what population your DNA matches the most today, but they can also, because they have samples from all over the world, they can pick out every population your DNA has matched and get a picture of how your ancestors migrated around the world from place to place over the past thousands of years. So let me start off by saying this though. We've all made block statements, like I am white, I am black, we are Hebrew Israelites. But I try to make certain we all know that due to slavery and choice, many of us, if not all of us, are mixed, and today what we are all doing really is acknowledging the portion of who we are that we relate to the most. For example, you may call yourself black knowing you have some European in you, but you call yourself black because of your ancestors' experience as slaves, and maybe you grew up in the South, so you obviously relate more to the black experience than the white. So it's not just about our ethnic mix, it boils down to your family history, and that ultimately determines what you call yourself. I personally desire to acknowledge the most original part of who I am. Before the mixing, before slave violations, I want to know exactly where I come from. I've called myself a Hebrew, particularly an Israelite, because I believe, based on history and documentation, that is where my people originate from. But I've gotten some very genuine comments from others who want to believe that they are Hebrew Israelite but can't fully follow after that idea because they don't have proof. And I've had recent dialogue with someone, and I won't mention his name because he may not want to be mentioned, but he was the one who persuaded me to finally get a DNA test, because it's really the next level for us to solidify where we truly come from. It's either that, or we continue to go by the name and ethnicity our former slave masters have attributed to us. And if you're like me, I'm not satisfied with being called African American or African. I'd like to go back further than that. So with that being said, in this video you will see my mix first, but you will see my ancestry in the end, where my people are from, dating back hundreds, even thousands of years. So here we go. In the example here, you see there's two types of scores DNA Tribes uses. The match likelihood index is the green bar, and the tribe score is the number in the parentheses. Match likelihood means that your combination of genes are that many times likely to be in that region of the world. And the tribe score in the parentheses means that your match likelihood score is that percent higher than the members of that population. The ML score is more important to me because it's looking at my DNA as it compares to other people in the world. The tribe score is really looking at the percentage I am above those within that population. I don't care too much about how much more or less my DNA matches those in the population. I'm more concerned with the different populations I link to around the world. So I'll be looking at the ML score mainly. And this here is an example DNA Tribes gives. Okay, part A is my unique genetic profile, and it presents some raw data information that hasn't been interpreted yet on a map, so I'm not going to deal with that part too much, but they give it to you because they want you to see the numbers your DNA produced that led to their analysis, and you have the right to see it since you're paying for it. But it's basically giving you 26 values on your mom's side and 26 values on your dad's, totaling 52 dimensions used to compute your ancestry. And this too is an example of what DNA Tribes gives. This is not my actual DNA data. But moving on to part B. So in part B, they call it my native population match results. And what they're doing is matching you to populations in a database of 964 native populations that have had very little movement or mixing within the last 500 years. So here's a map they provide to show you just how many populations around the world they sample from. And they're looking at the top 20 native populations of these 964 that you link most significantly with, whom you share DNA closest with. So what you're able to see is not only what population you link to, you can see the migration going back into time because it's showing you the order in which you link to those populations by score. In part B, it reflects your most recent origin close to 500 years ago. So this is 2014, so we're going all the way back to about the 1500s and all the other places my DNA is found based on the DNA of the populations there in the past 500 years until today. So here is my personal part B DNA results. You can see that going back no more than 500 years, when you look at that top green bar, that top score, my DNA traces back to Nigeria in great numbers, meaning that I share the DNA of the people there more than any other place in the world within the last 500 years. That red dot in the middle is Nigeria, and the pink dots represent other tribes my DNA was found in lesser concentrations. And the blue dots are other populations my DNA was found in even lesser concentrations. So if you look at the graph they provided, you see how heavily concentrated those dots are around Nigeria and the west coast of Africa, where the slave trade occurred. Most of us who stem from the transatlantic slave trade, if we get a DNA test done, it's going to link us to West Africa. There is no getting around that because that's the port where we were sold from, and that's where we dwelled prior to enslavement by Muslims. We resided there for hundreds of years, and many of us may have mixed, if not with the natives, with the Islamic slave owners who sold us off. So we have Africa in us. I expected to see that. Being there are many tribes in Africa, my DNA can be traced back to several of them. Once you mix with someone, whatever their mix is becomes your mix. So you see my DNA is most similar to those in Nigeria, but you also see traces of my DNA in other populations in Africa, in Guinea, in Cameroon, Benin, which by the way used to be known as the Kingdom of Ouida or Judah, if you research the 1747 map of the land. Okay, but remember, this is a recent DNA link to the past 500 years. We're going to go back further than this in part D, but first I want to show you part C. Now, part C they call my global population match results. Again, we're looking within a 500-year time frame from about the year 1500 to today. So they start back 500 years ago, and the DNA test actually shows my ancestors' migration out of Africa. Now, the circles indicate where my ancestors were closer to 500 years ago. The diamonds indicate where they ended up, where they migrated to. So you still see that significant red circle over in Nigeria, but when you look over to America, you see a bunch of diamonds. Looking at that yellow diamond over in Canada, yellow means that my DNA is highly linked to people of that population within the past 500 years. And there's another yellow diamond over in Ireland. That's Ireland way over there to the right. So for a long time, I've known my ancestors were owned by an Irish slave master. So this DNA test was actually able to pick up on that. My DNA matches that of a population in Ireland, thanks to the Irish slave owners who violated my ancestors. So what you're seeing is after being shipped from Africa, there was a mixing of Irish into my family after being sent to America. So from West Africa, you then see my ancestors in Canada. As a matter of fact, this portion of the test calls me Afro-Canadian. So after diaspora, my DNA matches most closely to that of the populations over in Canada, very close to New York. So the orange diamonds are the next significant group my DNA links to. If you look at the color key, but I don't have any orange on my map. So the next significant color match is red, and then pink, and then blue. So you see a migration of my family over into the Midwest, into the Minnesota area, down to Kansas, the Kansas-Oklahoma border, and then into Oklahoma, looking at the pink diamond now, and then looking at the blue diamond going over into the Mississippi-Alabama area, and then over again into the East Coast from the Massachusetts, Rhode Island area down south to North Carolina. I have DNA matches there too. And you see a blue diamond down in Florida, which is where I was born. You also see even more significant traces of my DNA in Cuba. But we all know as slaves we were shipped all over. So that explains why my DNA so strongly matches populations in Canada and Cuba at the same time. See those two red diamonds, one up high and the lowest one. Same thing with the blue diamonds, ranging from the Midwest to the East Coast and down south. So we as a people were all over the place as slaves. And if you look at the green bars, you'll see that African American is generally the title given to someone who came from Africa and ended up in America, regardless of how you got here. Okay, but keep in mind the diamonds represent where I am now. The circles indicate where I came from nearly 500 years ago, over in West Africa. Most of our DNA results will look a lot like this one, trust you me. Blacks in America, victims of the slave trade, our DNA is all over the place. The question is, where did we come from? Now the final part, part D, Tribe DNA calls it my world region match results, where they sample the native population along with other relatively close native populations, because immigration affects the numbers. They don't want to link you to a bunch of immigrants that reside in that land. They want to link you to the natives of that land that have had very little movement. So you're not just seeing where you're linked to, but what nations you're linked to, and get a clear picture of your true ethnicity. So part D, DNA tribes, claims is the most telling of your ancestry because it reveals, quote unquote, long-term patterns of migration over several millennia, which is several thousands of years, they say. So you're tracing back to 1000 AD, even further back to the time of the Messiah. And they say several thousands of years, so you can be looking back into BC, seeing what populations your DNA matches to. They say the highest number indicates my most recent geographical origin and where many of my ancestors currently reside, while subsequent scores indicate regions my ancestors migrated from prior. So you're actually able to see your ancestral migration throughout the world and get a clearer picture of where you're actually from. So as the numbers go down, it's like we're going further back into time. Now, I've seen several people misinterpret this part to mean the highest number is where your ancestors stem from. But that is not the case in part D. In part D, the highest number is where most of your ancestors are today. And if you're a so-called African American, due to persecution and slavery and the mixing of our ancestors, many of them today, if not scattered around the world, are still in the western portion of Africa. So the larger numbers are telling you where people with like DNA to yours mainly are today. But the smaller numbers are telling you where your ancestors came from over the past few thousand years. Okay, so we're looking at the recency effect. So in this case, the smaller numbers tell more about your ancestral migration than the large numbers. So that big circle and the smaller one in the Sahara, it doesn't tell you much. So look at the green bars below, and again you see West Africa as the most recent place my ancestors were in the 1500s. Before that, we see they resided in the Sahelian, which is like the Sahara part of Africa. And before that, it looks like they were in South Africa or Southern Africa. So there was a jump from South Africa to the Sahara, strangely enough, bypassing West Africa. But remember, the Sahara slave trade operated by Arab Muslims caused a lot of us to be transported throughout the Sahara as well. So that may be what I'm seeing, maybe, maybe not. So before the Sahara, my family was in South Africa. And before that, the African Great Lakes in East Africa. So we see them coming from East Africa down to South Africa, ended up in the Sahara, and then West Africa due to slavery. But before that, the Horn of Africa is where my people dwelled. Before that, North Africa. And then you see some DNA markers in the area of Arabia, but it doesn't stop there. DNA markers trace my ancestors before Arabia up into the Levant or the Levantine. The Levant mainly includes the area we would call today Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, and Jordan. That would be the Middle East. So from what's known today as the Middle East, my ancestors traveled to the area of Arabia and some into North Africa, into the Horn of Africa on the east, to the African Great Lakes in the east of Africa, down into South Africa, and then up into the Sahara or Sahelian portion of Africa, and then in great numbers over into West Africa, mainly Nigeria. That's the migration of my ancestors from the Middle East and into Africa, later to become victims of the transatlantic slave trade. I wanted to make certain I've interpreted my results correctly, so I contacted an analyst from DNAtribes.com, and he confirmed my results, saying to me that my results express DNA matches most recently found in the tropical west of Africa, but that my DNA also traces back to quote-unquote the Middle Eastern portion of the world. So many people, not just myself, have taught on how the Muslims who sold us to the Europeans called us the Yahudi, meaning the 12 tribes of Israel. But people have called it speculation. And many have taught on Israelite empires in and throughout Africa set up by Israelites who migrated into Africa to escape persecution, but people have called that speculation. Many have said that the so-called African Americans actually have Hebrew roots stemming from out of the Middle East, and based that not only on historical documentation, but also on the rituals and culture of many of us descending from slavery. We were not initially Christians, but Torah keepers. But I've been met with some who say we're African, and until you can prove it with DNA, that's what we'll be. So here you go, my personal DNA proof that my ancestors stem out of the populations of the Middle East. And I'm not a diamond in the rough here. You saw the map of my DNA matching throughout the South, where many of my people dwelled. We were all in this together, meaning your DNA is likely to look a lot like mine if you get it tested. So we're not just merely West Africans. We have a long, long history before that. And I encourage you all to consider getting your own DNA tested and trace your ancestors' migration through history. Now, this DNA test doesn't tell us everything, but when I combine it with the already existing historical proof that the so-called African American is Hebrew, moreover Hebrew Israelite, and that our ancestors were keepers of the Torah, that's enough for me to continue to teach what I teach. So that's all I have for you guys today. Blessings to you all. Until next time, this is Judaiah. Shalom.